Have you ever thought about why the most powerful people in history often won by losing? Why some of the greatest victories came not from fighting harder, but from giving up entirely? What if I told you that surrender is not the opposite of power, but perhaps its most sophisticated expression? This video will change how you see conflict, resistance, and the very nature of strength itself. Because today, we are exploring Law 22 from the 48 Laws of Power. Use the surrender tactic. Transform weakness into power. When you are weaker, never fight for honor's sake. Choose surrender instead. Diffuse your enemy's anger by surrendering. You will have time to recover, time to torment and irritate, time to wait for his power to wane. Do not give them the satisfaction of fighting and defeating you. Surrender first. Turn the other cheek and you will infuriate them. Make surrender a tool of power. Now, before you dismiss this as cowardice, before you think this is about weakness and defeat, let me stop you right there. This law is perhaps the most counterintuitive, the most psychologically sophisticated of all the laws of power. Because it requires you to do something that goes against every instinct, every lesson you have been taught since childhood. It requires you to lose on purpose. To give up when you could still fight. To bow when you want to stand tall. And yet, paradoxically, this is how you win. Not just win a single battle, but win the entire war. This is about playing a game that your opponent does not even realize is being played. Let me take you back in time. Not to battlefields or throne rooms, but to the very origins of human conflict itself. 2 million years ago, on the plains of Africa, our ancestors faced a fundamental problem. When two individuals wanted the same thing, a piece of food, a mate, a sleeping spot, what happened? The predictable response is violence. Fight until one wins. And indeed, many animals do exactly this. Stags lock antlers. Lions battle for prides. But here's what is fascinating. Our ancestors evolved something more sophisticated. They evolved submission displays. When a weaker individual realized they could not win, they would perform ritualized behaviors. They would lower their gaze. They would make themselves smaller. They would expose vulnerable parts of their body. And something remarkable would happen. The aggression would stop. The stronger individual, satisfied with the display of submission, would walk away without killing. This was not weakness. This was survival. This was the protoform of Law 22, encoded into our DNA millions of years before civilization even existed. Think about what this means. Before language, before tools, before culture, our brains already understood that sometimes the smart move is not to fight. Sometimes survival requires you to display weakness even when you have strength left. This is not learned behavior. This is evolutionary wisdom. And it is so deeply embedded in us that even today, even in our modern world of laws and police and civilization, we still respond to submission displays in predictable ways. When someone bows, when someone apologizes, when someone surrenders, something in our brain says, the threat is over, move on. This is the biological foundation of Law 22. You are not inventing a new trick. You are accessing an ancient program that exists in every human brain. Fast forward to ancient China, around 500 BC. There was a military strategist named Sun Tzu who wrote a text called The Art of War. And in this text, he wrote something that still baffles Western minds today. He said the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Not to defeat them in glorious combat. Not to prove your strength. But to win without fighting at all. How? By understanding that every act of aggression costs energy, creates enemies, and sows the seeds of future conflict. The truly powerful, Sun Tzu understood, make their enemies defeat themselves. They create situations where resistance is futile, where surrender is the only rational choice, and where the act of surrender itself becomes a weapon. Sun Tzu was describing something that goes beyond military strategy. He was describing a philosophy of power itself. In the West, we have this idea that power comes from force, from the ability to impose your will through strength. But in Eastern philosophy, there is a different understanding. Power comes from flexibility, from the ability to adapt, from the wisdom to know when to push and when to yield. The bamboo survives the storm that breaks the oak. The water wears away the stone. The soft overcomes the hard. This is not poetic metaphor. This is practical wisdom about how power actually works in the real world over long periods of time. Now let us jump to 15th century Italy. The city-states are at war, constantly, endlessly. And there is this young noble named Cesare Borgia. You might know him from Machiavelli's writings. Cesare understood something profound. When you conquer a city through violent assault, you create resentment. The people you conquer will rebel the moment you show weakness. But what if you give them a choice? What if you offer generous terms of surrender before you attack? Cesare would surround a city with his army, but instead of attacking, he would send emissaries. Surrender now, and you keep your lives, your property, your dignity. Resist, and we will destroy everything. City after city chose surrender. And here is the genius. These cities, having chosen to surrender rather than being forced, had made a psychological commitment. They had agency in their defeat. And people who choose their fate, even when that fate is submission, are far less likely to rebel than people who have submission forced upon them. Cesare understood that the appearance of choice transforms surrender from humiliation into pragmatism. This is a crucial insight that applies to every power dynamic you will ever encounter. When you force someone to do something, you create resentment. They comply, but they hate you for it. They wait for a chance to rebel. But when you give someone a choice, even if that choice is between two options you control, they feel agency. They feel like they made a decision. And once they have made that decision, cognitive dissonance kicks in. They need to justify their choice to themselves. So they convince themselves it was the right choice. They become invested in the outcome. This is why smart bosses do not just give orders. They present options and let employees choose. This is why smart parents do not just demand obedience. They offer controlled choices. And this is why smart conquerors do not just crush opponents. They offer terms of surrender that the opponent can accept without losing all dignity. But let me give you a modern example that will make this crystal clear. Google. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, dozens of search engines existed. AltaVista, Yahoo, Ask Jeeves, and many others. When Google entered the market, it was the weakest player. It had less funding, less brand recognition, less market share than its competitors. So what did Google do? Did it try to compete head-on with massive marketing campaigns? Did it try to outfeature the established players? No. Google surrendered. It made its homepage absurdly simple. Just a logo and a search box. It surrendered the entire concept of being a portal, of keeping users on its site, of bombarding them with news and weather and stock quotes and everything else that other search engines thought was essential. Google surrendered all of that. And in doing so, it won. Because users, exhausted by the clutter and noise of other search engines, flocked to Google's simplicity. Google's surrender to minimalism was actually a conquest. By giving up everything its competitors thought was valuable, it gained everything they wanted but could not achieve. Market dominance. Think about what Google actually did here. Every other search engine was fighting to keep users on their site as long as possible. More time on site meant more ad impressions, more revenue. So they packed their homepages with content. News, weather, stock quotes, email, chat, shopping, everything. The business model was built on capturing attention. And Google said, we surrender that entire business model. We are going to make it as easy as possible for users to leave our site. We are going to give them exactly what they want as fast as possible and send them on their way. This seemed insane. How do you make money if users leave immediately? But Google understood something deeper. They understood that the war was not about time on site. The war was about trust and habit. If users trusted Google to give them the best results fastest, they would come back every single time they needed to search. Google would become the default, the habit, the reflex. And once you own the default behavior, you own everything. Google surrender the battle for attention to win the war for habit. Let me explain the psychology of why this works, because this is where it gets truly fascinating. Human beings have an aggression instinct. When someone resists us, when someone fights us, our brain releases a cascade of chemicals. Adrenaline, cortisol, testosterone. We become focused on the enemy. We become obsessed with defeating them. All of our mental energy, all of our resources, become dedicated to this conflict. This is the fight response, and it is incredibly costly. It drains us. It makes us predictable. It narrows our thinking. But here is what happens when someone surrenders. The aggression has nowhere to go. Imagine you are winding up to punch someone, and just as you are about to strike, they fall to their knees and beg for mercy. What happens to all that aggressive energy? It dissipates. It feels unsatisfying. You feel confused. You might even feel embarrassed. Because aggression requires resistance. Without resistance, aggression becomes cruelty, and cruelty makes the aggressor feel like a villain. Most people, even cruel people, do not want to see themselves as villains. They want to see themselves as righteous, as justified. Surrender robs them of that justification. This is one of the most powerful psychological mechanisms in human interaction. We need to feel justified in our aggression. We need to believe we are the good guy. This is why in every war, both sides claim to be defending themselves. This is why in every conflict, both parties insist the other side started it. We cannot tolerate seeing ourselves as the aggressor, as the bully, as the villain. So we construct narratives that justify our actions. But when someone surrenders completely, when they offer no resistance, when they acknowledge your superiority and accept your terms, what narrative can you construct? You cannot say you are defending yourself from someone who is not attacking. You cannot say you are fighting for justice against someone who has already submitted to your justice. The surrender short-circuits your entire justification mechanism. And without justification, continuing aggression feels wrong. It feels excessive. It feels like bullying. So you stop. You move on. You find a different target. This is the power of surrender. It uses your enemy's own psychology against them. Now let me tell you about one of the most brilliant practitioners of Law 22 in modern history. Nelson Mandela. When Mandela was imprisoned on Robben Island, he was placed in conditions designed to break him. The apartheid government wanted him to resist, to fight back, to give them an excuse to justify their brutality. And what did Mandela do? He surrendered. Not his principles, not his beliefs, but his need to resist in obvious ways. He was polite to his guards. He learned Afrikaans, the language of his oppressors. He studied their culture, their history, their poetry. He made himself non-threatening. And something extraordinary happened. Over years, over decades, his guards began to see him not as a dangerous enemy, but as a human being. Some became his friends. Some became his advocates. When Mandela was finally released, he had transformed his prison into a school, his guards into students, and his imprisonment into a moral victory that ultimately brought down the entire apartheid system. He won by surrendering the fight, by refusing to be the enemy they needed him to be. What Mandela understood was that the apartheid government needed him to be a terrorist, a violent revolutionary, a threat to white South Africa. That narrative justified their oppression. That narrative maintained their power. As long as Mandela played the role of dangerous enemy, he strengthened their position. But by refusing to play that role, by surrendering the fight while maintaining his dignity and principles, he broke their narrative. He became something they could not categorize. He became a political prisoner who acted like a statesman. A convicted criminal who behaved like a moral authority. A powerless inmate who somehow commanded more respect than his jailers. This cognitive dissonance ate away at the foundations of apartheid. How do you justify imprisoning a man who acts with more grace and wisdom than you do? How do you maintain a system of racial superiority when the supposedly inferior race produces someone like Mandela? By surrendering the fight, Mandela won the argument. By accepting imprisonment, he gained moral authority. By yielding, he conquered. This brings us to a crucial distinction. There is a difference between surrendering and giving up. Giving up is permanent. It is acceptance of defeat. It is the end of ambition. Surrender, in the context of Law 22, is tactical. It is temporary. It is a strategic retreat that allows you to survive, to regroup, to wait for a better moment. Think of it like this. A tree in a storm. The oak tree, strong and rigid, resists the wind with all its might. And when the storm is strong enough, the oak breaks. But the willow tree bends. It surrenders to the wind. It allows itself to be pushed almost to the ground. And when the storm passes, the willow springs back, unbroken. Surrender is the wisdom of the willow. It is strength through flexibility. It is the understanding that temporary submission is preferable to permanent destruction. The oak dies proud. The willow survives humble. And survival is the foundation of all future power. Let me give you another historical example that perfectly illustrates this. Japan, after World War II. Japan had just experienced total defeat. 2 atomic bombs. Cities in ruins. Millions dead. Its military dissolved. Its emperor forced to renounce his divinity. By every measure, Japan had lost completely. And what did Japan do? It surrendered absolutely. It accepted American occupation. It allowed its constitution to be rewritten. It transformed from a military empire into a pacifist nation almost overnight. This surrender was so complete, so total, that it confused the victors. America had prepared for resistance, for guerrilla warfare, for a long and bloody occupation. Instead, Japan cooperated fully. And within 30 years, Japan had become the second largest economy in the world. It had conquered global markets not with armies, but with technology and manufacturing. Sony, Toyota, Honda, Panasonic. Japanese companies dominated industries worldwide. Japan lost the war but won the peace. Its surrender was not an end, but a transformation. By accepting temporary military defeat, Japan achieved permanent economic power. Think about the strategic genius of this. Japan looked at the situation in 1945 and made a calculation. We cannot win militarily. America has nuclear weapons. America has an army that dwarfs ours. America controls the seas and the skies. We can resist and be utterly destroyed, every city burned, every citizen killed. Or we can surrender completely and live. Most nations would have chosen some middle path. Surrender but with conditions. Surrender but maintain some pride. Surrender but keep fighting through insurgency. Japan chose complete surrender. And this complete surrender did something remarkable. It disarmed American aggression. America came prepared to punish, to exact revenge, to reshape Japan by force. But you cannot punish someone who has already surrendered completely. You cannot exact revenge from someone who offers no resistance. So instead, America helped Japan rebuild. The Marshall Plan poured money into Japan. American military might protected Japan from external threats. And Japan used this breathing room to completely reinvent itself. It took Western technology and improved it. It took Western management techniques and refined them. It studied American business and learned to beat America at its own game. By 1980, Japan was challenging American economic dominance. By surrendering the war, Japan won the century. Now, let us talk about the mechanics of how to actually use this law. Because surrender is not just about giving up. It is about how you give up. The manner of your surrender determines whether it is a tool of power or actual defeat. First, timing. You must surrender before you are completely broken. If you wait until you have no choice, until you are on your knees begging, your surrender has no power. It is just defeat. But if you surrender while you still have some strength, some options, some dignity, your surrender becomes a choice. And choices have power. It signals that you are rational, that you are strategic, that you understand the bigger picture. It makes your enemy respect you, even as they defeat you. Think of it like poker. The worst time to fold is when you have no chips left. The best time to fold is when you still have enough chips to play another hand. Same principle applies to surrender. Surrender from a position of some remaining strength, not from total weakness. Second, manner. Your surrender must be graceful. Not resentful, not bitter, not grudging. You must make it seem like the natural, obvious, even wise choice. If you surrender while glaring and threatening revenge, you have accomplished nothing. Your enemy will remain vigilant. They will continue to see you as a threat. But if you surrender with good humor, with grace, even with compliments to your conqueror, something shifts. They relax. They lower their guard. They begin to think of you not as an enemy, but as a reasonable person who simply backed the wrong side. This opens possibilities for future alliance, for rehabilitation, for eventual return to power. The samurai had a concept called losing with honor. It was not about fighting to the death. It was about accepting defeat gracefully, acknowledging the superior skill of your opponent, and maintaining your dignity in loss. This kind of surrender actually increased your status. It showed wisdom, maturity, self-control. The person who loses gracefully is more respected than the person who wins ungracefully. Third, incompleteness. This is subtle but crucial. Your surrender should be complete in appearance but incomplete in reality. You surrender your position, your resources, your public power. But you do not surrender your relationships, your knowledge, your long-term goals. You retreat from the battlefield but you do not leave the war. You become invisible, non-threatening, forgotten. And while your enemy celebrates their victory and moves on to other concerns, you quietly rebuild. You make new alliances. You learn new skills. You wait. And when the moment is right, when your enemy has become complacent, when circumstances have shifted, you return. But you return transformed, attacking from an unexpected angle, using methods they did not anticipate. This is the deep game of Law 22. Surrender is not the end of the game. It is a move in the game. A strategic sacrifice of temporary power for future advantage. Let me tell you about a modern example that everyone knows but few understand through this lens. Apple in the 1990s. Apple was dying. Microsoft had won the personal computer wars. Apple's market share had dwindled to almost nothing. The company was months away from bankruptcy. And then Steve Jobs returned. And what did he do? He surrendered. He called his greatest enemy, Bill Gates, and he made a deal. Microsoft invested $150 million in Apple. Microsoft agreed to keep making Office for Mac. In exchange, Apple dropped all its lawsuits against Microsoft. Apple acknowledged Microsoft's victory in the PC wars. This surrender shocked everyone. Apple fanatics felt betrayed. They saw this as selling out to the enemy. But Jobs understood Law 22 perfectly. He surrendered the battle he was losing so he could survive to fight a different war. And what happened? Within a few years, Apple stopped trying to beat Microsoft at PCs. Instead, it created entirely new categories. The iPod. The iPhone. The iPad. Apple surrendered in personal computers and conquered in mobile devices. By the time Microsoft realized what was happening, it was too late. Apple had become the most valuable company in the world, and Microsoft was playing catch-up in a game Apple had invented. Jobs used surrender to buy time, to redirect energy, to attack from an unexpected direction. The brilliance of what Jobs did cannot be overstated. In 1997, everyone knew what the battlefield was. Personal computers. Operating systems. Microsoft versus Apple. Windows versus Mac. And Microsoft was winning. Decisively. Apple had maybe 3% market share. It was bleeding money. Every analyst predicted Apple would either go bankrupt or be acquired. Jobs could have kept fighting that war. He could have insisted on competing with Windows. He could have died proud, fighting for the Mac until the bitter end. But instead, he did something radical. He surrendered. He said, "You know what? Microsoft won. Windows won. We lost the PC wars. Congratulations. Now can we move on?" And by surrendering that battlefield, he freed himself to imagine new battlefields. What if the future is not about personal computers? What if it is about music players? What if it is about phones? What if it is about tablets? By surrendering the old game, Jobs got to invent a new game. And in the new game, Apple made the rules. Now let us dive deeper into the psychology of the person who conquers you. Because understanding their mind is key to using surrender effectively. When someone defeats you, they experience a surge of satisfaction. Their ego is validated. They feel powerful. And this feeling of power makes them magnanimous. They become generous to the defeated. Think about sports. When a team wins by a huge margin, they often show respect to the losing team afterward. They say things like, "You played well, you will come back stronger." This is not just politeness. It is psychological necessity. The victor needs to see themselves as noble, not as a bully. Your complete surrender allows them this self-image. And when they see themselves as noble, they treat you better than if they still saw you as a threat. You transform from enemy to supplicant. And supplicants receive mercy. Enemies receive destruction. But there is another psychological dynamic at play. Boredom. When you fight, you are interesting. You are a challenge. You occupy your enemy's mind. They think about you. They plan against you. They dedicate resources to defeating you. But when you surrender, you become boring. You are no longer a puzzle to solve, a challenge to overcome. Your enemy's attention moves elsewhere. They have other battles to fight, other enemies to conquer. You fade into the background. And this invisibility is incredibly valuable. Because while they are not watching you, you can do things. You can rebuild. You can make alliances. You can prepare. The greatest danger to power is attention. When everyone is watching you, you cannot move freely. Every action is scrutinized. Every move is anticipated. But when you have surrendered, when you appear defeated and harmless, you become invisible. And invisibility is freedom. You can do things in the shadows that would be impossible in the light. Let me share a story about a man named Alcibiades. He was an Athenian general in ancient Greece, during the Peloponnesian War. Alcibiades was brilliant but reckless. He made enemies in Athens, and eventually, they turned against him. He was accused of crimes and faced execution. So what did he do? He defected to Sparta, Athens' mortal enemy. He surrendered completely to the Spartans. He adopted their lifestyle, their customs, their diet. He became more Spartan than the Spartans themselves. And they welcomed him. They made him an advisor. They trusted him with military strategy. But Alcibiades had not actually surrendered. He was playing a longer game. He used his position in Sparta to undermine both Athens and Sparta, creating situations that benefited only him. Eventually, he would defect again and again, always surrendering to whoever would have him, always using that surrender to gain position and influence. Alcibiades understood that surrender is not loyalty. It is a tool. And tools can be used repeatedly, with different targets, for different purposes. What makes Alcibiades so fascinating is that he had no permanent loyalties. He was not Athenian or Spartan. He was Alcibiades. His only loyalty was to his own power and survival. This made him incredibly flexible. When Athens turned against him, he did not die for Athenian honor. He surrendered his Athenian identity and became Spartan. When Sparta grew suspicious, he surrendered his Spartan identity and became Persian. Then back to Athenian. He shapeshifted, always surrendering to the current power structure, always finding a way to make himself valuable to whoever was in charge. Most people cannot do this because they are attached to their identity. They would rather die as an Athenian than live as a Spartan. But Alcibiades understood that identity is a costume. You can change costumes. And by being willing to change costumes, by surrendering your attachment to any particular identity, you gain the freedom to survive in any system. This is the ultimate application of Law 22. Surrender your very identity if necessary. Because you can always reclaim it later. But you cannot reclaim anything if you are dead. Now, we need to talk about the shadow side of this law. Because Law 22 has a dark underbelly that can trap the unwary. The danger is that tactical surrender can become permanent submission. If you surrender too often, if you make it your default response, you stop being a strategic player and become a perpetual victim. People begin to see you not as clever or flexible, but as weak and spineless. There is a fine line between strategic surrender and learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is a psychological condition where, after repeated defeats, an individual stops trying to escape or resist even when escape becomes possible. They have internalized their powerlessness. This is the trap of Law 22. If you use it too much, if you surrender when you could actually win, you reprogram your own psychology. You begin to believe your own performance of weakness. The key to avoiding this trap is maintaining your internal sense of power even as you display external submission. This requires a kind of psychological compartmentalization. Publicly, you are defeated. You acknowledge your loss. You defer to your conqueror. But privately, in your own mind, you remain unbroken. You know that this is temporary. You know that you are choosing this. You know that you will return. This internal-external split is crucial. Without it, surrender becomes real defeat. With it, surrender remains a tool. Think of it like method acting. A method actor becomes the character completely when on stage. But when they go home, they return to their real self. They do not confuse the performance with reality. Same with strategic surrender. You perform weakness and defeat convincingly. But you do not internalize it. You do not let the performance become your reality. Let me tell you about a fascinating study done by social psychologists. They studied negotiation tactics and found something surprising. Negotiators who made early concessions, who surrendered points readily in the beginning of a negotiation, actually ended up with better overall deals than negotiators who fought for every point. Why? Because early surrender built goodwill. It made the other side feel like they were winning. It made them relax. It made them reciprocate with concessions of their own. But here is the crucial part. The successful negotiators only surrendered on points that did not matter to them. They gave up things they did not care about, creating the appearance of significant compromise, while holding firm on the points that actually mattered. This is Law 22 in action. Strategic surrender on irrelevant battles to win the important war. Think about what this means for your life. In any negotiation, any conflict, any power struggle, there are things that matter and things that do not. Most people make the mistake of fighting for everything equally. They defend every point with equal vigor. But this is exhausting and counterproductive. It makes you seem rigid and unreasonable. The smart move is to identify what actually matters to you and surrender everything else freely and gracefully. Want to negotiate salary? Surrender on start date, on job title, on office location. Make those concessions easily. This makes you seem reasonable and creates reciprocity. Then, when you ask for the salary you want, they feel obligated to reciprocate your reasonableness. You surrendered 3 things that did not matter to get the one thing that did matter. This is not weakness. This is strategy. Now let us talk about surrender in the context of modern corporate politics. Imagine you work in a company. You have a boss who is insecure, who feels threatened by competent subordinates. The instinctive response is to prove yourself, to show how capable you are, to outshine your boss. But this is a trap. The more competent you appear, the more threatened your boss feels, the more they will undermine you. Law 22 suggests a different approach. Surrender. Make mistakes, but only small ones. Ask for help on things you could figure out yourself. Give your boss credit for your ideas. Make them feel superior. This looks like weakness, but it is actually strategy. Because what are you really surrendering? Your ego. Your need for recognition. But what are you gaining? Your boss's trust. Their relaxed vigilance. Their willingness to promote you rather than sabotage you. You sacrifice credit to gain actual power. And in the long run, power matters more than credit. I have seen this play out countless times in corporate environments. The person who insists on getting credit for their ideas, who constantly showcases their intelligence, who makes their boss feel inferior, this person does not get promoted. They get sidelined. They get labeled as difficult or not a team player. Meanwhile, the person who gracefully lets their boss take credit, who asks for guidance they do not need, who makes their boss look good, this person rises. Why? Because they understand that bosses have power over your career. You can be right and unemployed, or you can be strategic and successful. Most people choose being right. Smart people choose being successful. Law 22 is about making the hard choice to surrender your ego for your advancement. Let me share another historical example that shows the sophistication of this law. Talleyrand, the French diplomat who served under Napoleon. Talleyrand was a master of survival. He served the monarchy, then the revolution, then Napoleon, then the restored monarchy again. He survived every regime change for 40 years in one of the most turbulent periods in French history. How? By mastering the art of strategic surrender. Whenever a new regime came to power, Talleyrand would surrender completely to it. He would pledge loyalty. He would offer his services. He would become indispensable. But he never actually committed himself completely. He always kept back channels open. He always maintained relationships with all sides. And when a regime fell, as they inevitably did, Talleyrand would simply transfer his loyalty to the new winners. He surrendered repeatedly, but never permanently. And because of this, he died wealthy, honored, and powerful, while most of his contemporaries died on the guillotine or in exile. Talleyrand's genius was understanding that political systems are temporary but survival is permanent. Most people make the mistake of identifying completely with a regime, a leader, a party. They tie their fate to a particular power structure. And when that power structure falls, they fall with it. But Talleyrand understood that all power structures are temporary. Kings become presidents, become emperors, become kings again. The faces change. The names change. The ideologies change. But underneath, the game remains the same. So Talleyrand played the game, not for any particular player, but for himself. He surrendered to every winner. He served every master. But he served them all superficially, maintaining enough distance that when they fell, he did not fall with them. This is the ultimate expression of Law 22. Surrender completely but temporarily to every power structure, maintaining your true loyalty only to yourself and your own survival. This brings us to a crucial question. When should you not use Law 22? Because like all laws of power, this one has limits. There are situations where surrender is simply defeat, where it will destroy you rather than save you. First, do not surrender when your enemy wants your complete destruction. Some enemies do not want submission. They want annihilation. Hitler did not want the Jews to surrender. He wanted them exterminated. In such cases, surrender offers no protection. You must fight or flee, but surrender is not an option. How do you know if your enemy wants submission or annihilation? Listen to their rhetoric. If they talk about defeating you, containing you, controlling you, they want submission. If they talk about eliminating you, purifying, cleansing, exterminating, they want annihilation. Know the difference. Your life depends on it. Second, do not surrender when your power depends on perception of strength. If you are a bodyguard, and you surrender to an attacker, you are finished. Your entire value was in your ability to protect. Once you show you will not fight, you are worthless. Similarly, if you are a military leader, a gang member, a tough guy reputation, anything where your power comes from your willingness to fight, surrender destroys your power base completely. In these cases, you must fight even if you lose, because the perception of courage is more valuable than survival. This sounds harsh, but it is reality. Some positions require you to die rather than surrender. The bodyguard who runs away lives, but he will never work again. The bodyguard who dies protecting his client becomes a legend and his family is taken care of. Choose your profession accordingly. Third, do not surrender when the cost of surrender exceeds the cost of defeat. Sometimes, fighting and losing is better than surrendering. If surrender means betraying your core values, your essential identity, your most important relationships, then it is too expensive. Death with honor can be preferable to life with shame, depending on your circumstances and your culture. This is a personal calculation. Only you can decide what you are willing to surrender and what you will die to protect. But make that decision consciously, with full awareness of the costs and benefits. Do not surrender reflexively out of fear. And do not fight reflexively out of pride. Calculate. Decide. Act. But for most situations, most conflicts, most battles, Law 22 is the intelligent choice. Because most conflicts are not life or death. They are ego battles. Status competitions. Resource disputes. And in these cases, surrender is almost always the smart play. You live to fight another day. You preserve your resources. You deny your enemy the satisfaction of a dramatic victory. And most importantly, you maintain the flexibility to change strategies, to attack from new angles, to eventually win through means your enemy never anticipated. The person who never surrenders, who fights every battle to the bitter end, ends up exhausted, broke, and alone. The person who surrenders strategically ends up rested, resourced, and surrounded by allies. Choose wisely. Let me tell you about a modern tech example. Microsoft and mobile phones. In the early 2010s, Microsoft tried to compete with Apple and Android in smartphones. They bought Nokia. They invested billions. They fought hard. And they lost. Completely. Windows Phone became a punchline. So what did Microsoft do under Satya Nadella? They surrendered. They discontinued Windows Phone. They stopped trying to compete in mobile operating systems. They even started making apps for iOS and Android, their competitors' platforms. This looked like total defeat. Tech journalists wrote obituaries for Microsoft's mobile dreams. But here is what actually happened. By surrendering in mobile OS, Microsoft freed up resources to dominate in cloud computing with Azure. They stopped fighting a war they could not win and started fighting a war they could win. Today, Microsoft is worth over $3 trillion, while Nokia, the company they once bought to save their mobile strategy, is an afterthought. Nadella understood Law 22. He surrendered the battle to win the war. What Nadella did was psychologically difficult. Microsoft had invested billions in mobile. They had employees whose entire careers were built around Windows Phone. They had partners who had committed to the platform. Surrendering meant admitting all of that was a mistake. It meant admitting defeat publicly. It meant enduring ridicule from competitors and criticism from investors. But Nadella had the courage to surrender. He looked at the situation honestly and said, "We lost. We are not going to catch Apple or Android. Every dollar we spend on mobile OS is a wasted dollar. Let us redirect those resources to cloud computing where we actually have a competitive advantage." This is mature leadership. This is strategic thinking. This is Law 22 in action. Now let us explore the relationship between surrender and time. Because time is the secret weapon of Law 22. When you fight, the conflict happens now. It is immediate. All resources, all attention, all energy is consumed in this present moment. But when you surrender, you introduce delay. The conflict is over, for now. Your enemy celebrates and moves on. But you are still there. You are still alive. You are still thinking. And with time, everything changes. Your enemy becomes complacent. They develop new weaknesses. The situation shifts. New alliances become possible. Time is the great equalizer. The weak, given enough time, can become strong. The strong, given enough time, can become weak. Surrender is a way of buying time. And in the long game of power, time is often more valuable than temporary victory. Think about it this way. When you are fighting, you are locked into the present. You have to respond to attacks. You have to defend positions. You have to allocate resources to the immediate threat. Your timeline becomes compressed. Everything is urgent. Everything is now. But when you surrender, you escape the tyranny of the urgent. You can think long-term. You can plan. You can prepare. You can wait for the perfect moment. Your enemy, meanwhile, is still operating on the compressed timeline. They are fighting new battles. They are dealing with new enemies. They have moved on from you. And while they are distracted by the present, you are building the future. When you finally strike, they are not ready. They have forgotten about you. They have underestimated you. And you win not through superior force, but through superior timing. There is a concept in martial arts called yielding. In Tai Chi, in Aikido, in Judo, the principle is the same. You do not meet force with force. You yield. You redirect. You use your opponent's energy against them. When they push, you pull. When they pull, you push. When they attack, you step aside and let their momentum carry them past you. This is physical surrender used as a fighting technique. And it is devastatingly effective. A small person who understands yielding can defeat a much larger opponent, because the larger opponent's strength becomes a liability. They commit to an attack, and you are not there. Their energy is wasted. They become exhausted fighting empty air. Law 22 is the psychological equivalent of yielding. You do not meet ego with ego. You do not meet aggression with aggression. You yield. You surrender. And in doing so, you make your opponent waste their energy on a victory that means nothing. I once watched a video of a Tai Chi master fighting multiple opponents. These were not staged demonstrations. These were real fights. And what was remarkable was that the master never attacked. He only yielded. Opponents would charge at him, and he would step aside. They would punch, and he would deflect. They would grapple, and he would redirect their energy into throws. After a few minutes, all the opponents were exhausted, breathing hard, frustrated. And the master was calm, relaxed, barely winded. He had won without fighting. This is the physical manifestation of Law 22. And if it works in physical combat, imagine how much more effective it is in psychological combat, where energy and momentum are invisible but no less real. Let me share a personal anecdote that illustrates this. I once watched a corporate power struggle between a young ambitious manager and an older established executive. The young manager was talented, smart, full of ideas. The executive was entrenched, politically connected, but less innovative. The young manager made the mistake of challenging the executive publicly. He pointed out flaws in the executive's strategies. He presented better alternatives. He tried to prove he was right. And what happened? The executive crushed him. Not because the executive's ideas were better, but because the executive had power and the young manager did not. The young manager was transferred to a dead-end division and eventually left the company. But I also saw another young manager in a similar situation who understood Law 22. When the executive criticized his ideas, he did not defend them. He said, "You are absolutely right. I did not think of that. Thank you for correcting me." When the executive took credit for his work, he said, "I am just glad I could help execute your vision." He surrendered every battle. And what happened? The executive came to trust him. To rely on him. To promote him. Within 5 years, this young manager had become the executive's designated successor. And when the executive retired, the young manager took over and immediately implemented all the ideas he had surrendered years earlier. He won by losing. He conquered by submitting. This story illustrates something crucial. Surrender is not about abandoning your goals. It is about abandoning your timeline. The first young manager wanted to win now. He wanted recognition now. He wanted power now. And that impatience destroyed him. The second young manager was willing to wait. He understood that 5 years of appearing weak was a small price to pay for 30 years of being powerful. Most people cannot make this trade. They need validation now. They need to be right now. They need to win now. But power is a long game. And in the long game, patience beats pride every single time. This brings us to a deeper philosophical question. What is strength, really? Our culture worships overt displays of strength. The warrior who never backs down. The businessman who crushes all competition. The athlete who fights through pain. We see these as virtues. And in some contexts, they are. But there is another kind of strength that is less visible but more powerful. The strength to swallow your pride. The strength to endure humiliation without breaking. The strength to wait years for the right moment rather than acting impulsively now. This is the strength of water. Water is soft, yielding, seemingly weak. You can punch water and it will not resist. But water, given time, carves canyons through solid rock. Water adapts to any container but never loses its essential nature. Water surrenders to every obstacle but eventually wears away all opposition. Law 22 is about becoming like water. Soft on the surface, inexorable in the long run. Bruce Lee famously said, "Be like water. Empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. You put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put water into a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Water can flow, or it can crash. Be water, my friend." This is not just poetic philosophy. This is practical instruction for how to navigate power dynamics. Be formless. Adapt to whatever container you are placed in. Surrender your fixed shape. And in doing so, become unstoppable. Because the thing that has no fixed form cannot be attacked. The thing that surrenders cannot be defeated. The thing that flows around obstacles cannot be stopped. Now, we need to talk about the emotional cost of surrender. Because this is where Law 22 asks the most of you. Surrender hurts. It violates your sense of justice. It feels like betraying yourself. When you surrender, when you bow to someone you know is wrong, someone you could beat if circumstances were different, it creates a kind of spiritual injury. You feel like a coward. You feel ashamed. And this shame can be corrosive. It can eat at your self-respect, your sense of identity. This is why many people cannot use Law 22 effectively. They cannot bear the emotional cost. They would rather fight and lose than surrender and win, because fighting preserves their sense of honor. But here is the hard truth. Honor is a luxury of the powerful. When you are weak, when you are outmatched, honor will get you killed or destroyed. Survival requires pragmatism. And pragmatism often requires surrender. The key to managing this emotional cost is reframing. You must see surrender not as defeat, but as strategy. Not as weakness, but as wisdom. Not as cowardice, but as long-term thinking. This requires a different value system than the one most of us were raised with. It requires valuing results over process, outcomes over appearances, ultimate victory over temporary pride. This is not easy. It requires emotional maturity. It requires confidence in your own long-term plan. It requires the ability to tolerate short-term discomfort for long-term gain. Most people cannot do this. And that is why most people remain powerless. They cannot make the sacrifices that power requires. They cannot surrender their need to be seen as strong in order to actually become strong. Let me give you one more historical example that brings all of this together. Vietnam. In the 1960s and 70s, the United States, the most powerful military in human history, fought North Vietnam, one of the poorest countries on Earth. By every measure of power, America should have won easily. Better weapons, more resources, overwhelming technological advantage. But Vietnam won. How? By understanding Law 22 at a national level. Every time American forces attacked, Vietnamese forces retreated. They surrendered territory readily. They avoided direct confrontation. They used guerrilla tactics, appearing and disappearing, never giving America a conventional enemy to defeat. This looked like weakness. American military leaders were constantly declaring victory, claiming they were winning. But what was Vietnam actually doing? They were buying time. They were waiting for American public opinion to turn. They were waiting for America to grow tired of a war with no clear victory, no defined endpoint, no satisfying conclusion. And that is exactly what happened. America won every battle but lost the war. Vietnam surrendered every fight but achieved their ultimate goal. American forces withdrew. Vietnam was reunified under Northern control. Tactical surrender led to strategic victory. The Vietnam War is perhaps the perfect case study in Law 22. America had every advantage except one: patience. America needed to win quickly. The American public wanted results. Politicians needed victories to show voters. This compressed timeline was America's weakness. Vietnam had all the time in the world. They were fighting for their homeland. They could wait decades if necessary. So their strategy was simple. Surrender every battle. Retreat from every attack. Never give America the decisive victory it needed. Just survive. Just wait. Just outlast. And it worked. After years of fighting, after 58,000 American deaths, after billions of dollars spent, America gave up and went home. Vietnam won by losing every battle. They conquered by surrendering every fight. This is Law 22 at its most powerful and most complete. So what does all of this mean for you? How do you actually apply Law 22 in your life? First, you must learn to recognize when you are in a losing position. This requires honest self-assessment. Most people delude themselves. They think they are stronger than they are. They think they can win when they cannot. You must be ruthlessly honest about your actual power relative to your opponent. If you are weaker, if you cannot win, if continuing the fight will only destroy you, then surrender is not cowardice. It is intelligence. Look at your situation with clear eyes. Remove ego from the equation. Ask yourself, can I actually win this? And if the answer is no, then the next question is, how can I surrender in a way that maximizes my future power? Second, you must learn to swallow your pride. Pride is the enemy of Law 22. Pride says, I must fight. I must prove myself. I cannot back down. But pride will get you destroyed. You must value survival and ultimate victory over temporary validation. You must be willing to look weak today if it means being strong tomorrow. This is perhaps the hardest lesson to learn. Because our entire culture tells us that real men never back down, that winners never quit, that you should fight for what you believe in. But sometimes, fighting for what you believe in means dying for what you believe in. And dead people have no power. Dead people change nothing. Dead people lose. Survivors get to play again. Choose survival. Third, you must learn to think long-term. Law 22 only works if you have a long time horizon. If you need to win today, surrender will not help you. But if you can think in terms of years or decades, surrender becomes incredibly powerful. When you surrender, you are making a trade. You are trading short-term status for long-term power. You are trading temporary victory for ultimate success. Most people cannot make this trade because they cannot see far enough into the future. They are trapped in the present. They need validation now. But the truly powerful think in generations. They plant trees they will never sit under. They start projects they will never finish. They surrender battles they could win today to position themselves for wars they will win tomorrow. Fourth, you must maintain your internal strength even as you display external weakness. This is perhaps the hardest part. You must be able to surrender completely in manner while remaining unbroken in spirit. This requires a kind of double consciousness, a split between your public persona and your private self. Publicly, you are defeated. You acknowledge your loss. You defer to your conqueror. You play the role of the vanquished. But privately, in your own mind, in your own heart, you remain unbroken. You know that this is temporary. You know that you are choosing this. You know that you will return. This internal-external split is crucial. Without it, surrender becomes real defeat. With it, surrender remains a tool. It is the difference between being broken and bending. The broken thing cannot recover. The bent thing springs back. Second, you must learn to swallow your pride. Pride is the enemy of Law 22. Pride says, I must fight. I must prove myself. I cannot back down. But pride will get you destroyed. You must value survival and ultimate victory over temporary validation. You must be willing to look weak today if it means being strong tomorrow. This is perhaps the hardest lesson to learn. Because our entire culture tells us that real men never back down, that winners never quit, that you should fight for what you believe in. But sometimes, fighting for what you believe in means dying for what you believe in. And dead people have no power. Dead people change nothing. Dead people lose. Survivors get to play again. Choose survival. Third, you must learn to think long-term. Law 22 only works if you have a long-time horizon. If you need to win today, surrender will not help you. But if you can think in terms of years or decades, surrender becomes incredibly powerful. When you surrender, you are making a trade. You are trading short-term status for long-term power. You are trading temporary victory for ultimate success. Most people cannot make this trade because they cannot see far enough into the future. They are trapped in the present. They need validation now. But the truly powerful think in generations. They plant trees they will never sit under. They start projects they will never finish. They surrender battles they could win today to position themselves for wars they will win tomorrow. Fourth, you must maintain your internal strength even as you display external weakness. This is perhaps the hardest part. You must be able to surrender completely in manner while remaining unbroken in spirit. This requires a kind of double consciousness, a split between your public persona and your private self. Publicly, you are defeated. You acknowledge your loss. You defer to your conqueror. You play the role of the vanquished. But privately, in your own mind, in your own heart, you remain unbroken. You know that this is temporary. You know that you are choosing this. You know that you will return. This internal-external split is crucial. Without it, surrender becomes real defeat. With it, surrender remains a tool. It is the difference between being broken and bending. The broken thing cannot recover. The bent thing springs back. Finally, you must be patient. After you surrender, nothing will happen for a while. Your enemy will be focused elsewhere. You will be forgotten. This is not failure. This is exactly what you want. Use this time. Prepare. Learn. Build. Make new alliances. Develop new skills. Study your enemy's weaknesses. Wait for circumstances to change. And when the right moment comes, when circumstances shift in your favor, strike from an unexpected direction with methods your enemy never anticipated. The person who surrendered yesterday becomes the conqueror tomorrow. But only if they use their time in defeat wisely. Only if they never stopped preparing. Only if they remembered that surrender was a tactic, not a fate. There's one final aspect of Law 22 that we must address. The surrender of surrender itself. What do I mean by this? Sometimes, the most powerful move is to surrender your attachment to power itself. To stop playing the game entirely. This is the ultimate form of Law 22. When you stop caring about winning, when you genuinely let go of your need for power, you paradoxically gain a different kind of power. You become unpredictable. You become free. You cannot be threatened because you have nothing to lose. You cannot be tempted because you want nothing. This is the power of the monk, the hermit, the dropout. They have surrendered all worldly ambition, and in doing so, they have achieved a kind of invulnerability. The world cannot touch them because they have already given up everything the world could take. Now, I am not suggesting everyone should become a monk. But there is wisdom in this principle. Sometimes, the best way to win a game is to stop playing. If the game is rigged, if the cost of playing exceeds the value of winning, if the game itself is destroying you, then surrender the entire framework. Walk away. Create a new game with new rules. This is what many successful entrepreneurs do. They look at corporate hierarchies, realize the game is rigged against them, and instead of fighting their way up the ladder, they surrender the entire concept of climbing someone else's ladder. They build their own company. They create their own rules. They opt out of the game they could not win and create a new game they can win. This is surrender as creation. This is yielding as innovation. This is Law 22 at its most profound. So here we are, at the end of our exploration of Law 22. And I want to leave you with a question. A question that has no easy answer. What are you fighting for that you should be surrendering? What battle are you engaged in that is draining your energy, consuming your resources, and preventing you from seeing the larger war? What temporary pride are you protecting that is costing you permanent power? Because the truth is, most of us are fighting the wrong battles. We are defending positions that do not matter. We are proving points that nobody cares about. We are winning arguments and losing relationships. We are succeeding at tasks that lead nowhere. The wisdom of Law 22 is the wisdom to know when to let go. When to bend. When to yield. When to surrender today so you can conquer tomorrow. And here is the deepest, most uncomfortable truth of all. Power is not about never losing. Power is about losing strategically. It is about choosing which defeats to accept so you can engineer which victories to achieve. The person who never surrenders, who fights every battle, who dies on every hill, this person has no power. They are a slave to their own rigidity. But the person who can surrender gracefully, who can lose with dignity, who can wait years for the right moment, this person is truly powerful. Because they have mastered the hardest thing of all. They have mastered themselves. They have conquered their own ego, their own need for validation, their own attachment to being right. And once you have conquered yourself, conquering others becomes almost trivial. Because you are no longer fighting from fear or pride or desperation. You are fighting from strategy, from wisdom, from a place of inner strength that cannot be shaken by external defeat. So I ask you one final time. What will you surrender? What battle will you choose to lose so you can win the war? What temporary defeat will you accept to achieve lasting victory? This is not weakness. This is wisdom. This is not cowardice. This is strategy. This is not giving up. This is playing a longer, deeper, more sophisticated game than your opponents realize exists. This is Law 22. Use the surrender tactic. Transform weakness into power. Make surrender your weapon. And watch as your enemies defeat themselves while you wait, patient and unbroken, for the moment when the world turns and you rise again, unexpected and unstoppable, from the ashes of your carefully chosen defeats. The willow bends but does not break. The water yields but carves canyons. And you, understanding these lessons, surrender today to conquer tomorrow. This is the way of power. This is the path of the wise. This is Law 22.